It's Friday, Feedback Friday, the feedbackiest day of the week. It's Feedback Friday. And yes, I am as tired as I look. I'm gonna focus my comments on only the Wednesday video this week, which I did not share on on Twitter because I wanted to keep the lunatics out of the conversation so that people could actually ask questions and express themselves in something of a safe space. A few still got through and tried to be aggressive, and ironically, based on the very angry messages talking about how their original comment got erased, they got caught in YouTube's apparently very aggressive content algorithm. For the record, anybody who got your comment erased, that was not me. I even checked the hide for spam tab, or like the likely spam tab, or the held for review tab. Nothing's coming up there. So if YouTube wiped out your comment, it wasn't me, and there's nothing I can do about it. Nothing. That's YouTube. And I find it very telling of the people who just assumed I did it. When you come to a discussion with that kind of distrusting attitude, nothing good's going to come from it. So I'm not going to respond to those people. If you like this sort of attitude, help support this channel, become a monthly patron, patreon.com/LeannaK, and you'll see Zelda's in the co-pilot seat. Hi, Zelly Belly. Okay, so I am going to focus on the gender identity, gender expression, gender performance video, because the other two had like 98% likes. I'm kind of tired of talking about boob armor. There was some really good conversations about like nerding about Beskar metal and stuff like that. Little things here and there. I got linked to the same like shade diversity video like 20 times. No, I have not had a chance to watch it yet. Some people were like, I'm going to avoid nitpicking. I said, I was just generalizing, like that's what I assumed. So, it can be fun to be nerdy in that regard as long as everybody keeps it in bounds. The minute somebody gets offended, it's out of bounds. So there was just so much agreement there that we'll just leave it where it is, right? Like one of the things I try to do is be a dignified winner as well as a dignified loser. Like people just found Anita Sarkeesian's comments on boob armor just absurd in that context. So, and that's the whole problem with that camp, that type of activism is people are basically, I'm with you, I'm with you, I'm with you, I'm with you, I've lost you. And you can't have that. I think people are just sick to death of people going too far in either being offended or what they're demanding. And, if the summary of the contents on a lot of this stuff are to be believed, people generally are good with sort of reasonable accommodation. Once it starts feeling like, mind crimes, for lack of a better term, that's when people start going, no, I'm done. No more. And that's totally understandable, right? That makes complete sense. So, on to the stuff. I should say one thing. Patrons, check the patron message this week because there's a game code giveaway involved with some feedback stuff. So if you don't normally watch the patron videos or check the patron messages and you are a patron, check it out. If you'd like to participate in stuff like this, help support this channel, become a monthly patron, patreon.com/LeannaK. Okay, so there were a lot of people going, okay, thank you about explaining this stuff to me, which is good. People handled the why you shouldn't compare it to race thing well, which I'm glad. It's a difficult thing to explain. a couple people who I assume are trans based on the way they're speaking, um, said, I don't care if a term is outdated as long as people aren't throwing around outright slurs. Um, they just want what the quote was, and please listen to this if you are one of those but science people. Please listen to this. This is a trans person, okay? I just want people to use my name and pronouns and not try to lecture me on bunk stats or how there weren't any signs if you don't count all the signs. I guess those are people who, oh, I had no idea that you were, you were trans or non-binary or whatever. And it's like, what does it matter if you knew? Right? Like I've never quite understood that particular comment. I got quite a few people when I mentioned the thing about wearing pants in Catholic school. Multiple sources talked about how girls in their Catholic school preferred wearing pants because there was a creepy teacher. One person actually told me that the girls complained and were told to wear pants instead of the teacher being disciplined. And I'm just presenting that as feedback. I have no comment on that other than yikes. I personally don't agree with religious schooling. I understand up here it's part of our charter. It was, part of the peace agreement with the French Canadians, essentially, that we need a Catholic school system in our country. But I don't think schooling should be religiously oriented, period, end of story. One of the things that I'm very grateful for in my in my background was I went to a very multicultural school, and everybody learned about everybody's religions. My hope would be for everyone to be able to be in those environments, because it's just so much easier to see people as people when you have experience with a group of people as people, if that makes any sense. There were some people that did push back, and I'm not going to read the comments verbatim because I don't suspect they intended them as offensive, but they could be perceived as offensive. There seems to be two camps of sort of people who just don't want to get this. One are gender shouldn't matter that much, and the other are stop saying sex is a social construct. Now, I, up until fairly recently, was in that camp of gender shouldn't matter this much. Then I was told by somebody who is actually a psychology researcher at an accredited university that for most people, gender identity is detectable in the brain. They know where gender identity is in the brain. It's actually a thing that apparently fires differently when people see images that are like them gender-wise and not like them not gender-wise. So it's a real thing. I have a very weak one, and that was why I believed it wasn't that important. When I am presented with evidence like that, I do not, from a person who is an expert in their field, I do not look for specific studies. I did Google it on my own, and yes, it's multiple portions of the brain. Apparently, in male brains, certain areas light up more than others. Certain areas are slightly larger than others. And in female brains, different areas are different. And in people who are transgender, their brains actually do light up according to their gender identity, not their assigned gender. When I saw that, I'm like, well, there is, anatomical dimorphism, but obviously sex and gender are much more complicated than that. Obviously, there are certain identity things in the brain, and much like what happened with gay conversion therapy, the experiments trying to normalize people into their socially assigned gender were disasters. So, all that evidence indicates gender is not just a social construct. Because if gender is a social construct, then you can train someone to adhere to that social construct, right? Saying sex is a social construct actually undermines trans rights and trans dignity. Because if it's a social construct, well, then you can conform. It's just a series of gestures. That's why it's very important to recognize that gender expression, gender performance, and gender identity aren't the same thing. The idea that someone would say sexuality is a social construct, people wouldn't say that. Race is a social construct? Yes. And I went through why. We have evidence that the racial demarcations that we recognize are social constructs. So too are gender gender categories. The idea that there can only be one male gender identity and one female gender identity, and you're assigned those, that's set by society, right? A person's innate sense of who they are is not learned behavior. It's innate. And so when you get that reality, and the reality that not all cultures have only two genders, that's actually a very modern, very European, I'll say diaspora, because colonial is a touchy term, but that's a fairly modern thing in human history. You go back to the Talmud, you go back to a lot of modern indigenous cultures, like the whole two-spirit concept. That was alive and well. They didn't have to make that up. And two-spirit is a catch-all. Different First Nations indigenous groups have different terms and different gender categories. Some have 3, some have 5. There's a bunch. The two-spirit is sort of a catch-all term and not always appropriate. But these social constructs of gender are social constructs, right? How we sort this stuff are social constructs. But the fact that there is something innate in people that goes, I am this, that's not a mental illness, okay? That's an identity. And that's why it's very important that governments like the government of Canada enshrine that as a protected group, because that's an indication, no, a person's gender identity isn't something you can change. It isn't something you can cure. It is innate. And people get too reductive when we start talking about biological sex, and it's just anatomy. It's just external anatomy, which would have driven my late stepfather absolutely insane. He was a biologist. He was the chair of biology at the university he worked at. He was associate dean for many years when I was a kid. It drove him crazy when people interchanged biology and anatomy. Anatomy is, according to him, baby's first biology. It's rote memorization. He was a biochemist. And he believed that biochemistry was, the true art behind biology. It's a bit of a joke that every scientist thinks their science is the best one. But he was quite persuasive about it when he'd show you, okay, there are a few hundred bones in the human body, but there are thousands of biochemical systems in an organism. Quite persuasive. So maybe that's why I'm more open to this idea that biology and biological sex is not just, it doesn't come down to just a single body part. It's a combinations of things. It's androgens, it's biochemistry, it's physiology, it's, brain stuff. It's not a single thing. and it is anti-scientific to be reductive in this way. You know, the easiest answers are often wrong. And if we're actually arguing science, argue the actual complete science. Don't argue overly simplistic pseudoscience. That's what being raised by a biochemist taught me. Because, oh man, that got schooled out of me. Anatomy is biology. Woo! We're dealing with vaccines that are messenger RNA. Now, the idea that biology is just anatomy, we should be better than this, right? With all our knowledge and all our learning. But, that was the other thing he taught me about the different ways different scientists think about things, right? Physicists drove him crazy because they were too theoretical. And computer scientists drove him crazy because everything was a 1 or a 0. And that just, biochemistry is actually quite a delicate field. So that you can leave all the nasty, angry comments you want. I'm not budging from this point either way. I'm not going to agree that sex is a social construct. That's something that biological sex is a social construct. No, that's absurd. That's something that's only come around in the last 10, 15 years. When I was taking gender studies, it was gender is a social construct. Sex, anatomical, biological sex is something very different. And if the problem is, if anatomical sex, if biological sex, not anatomical sex, identity, who you feel you are, your identity, if that is a construct, then that's the thing that has to change. And that means people are slaves to the inevitability of their anatomy. That's not right. Every time somebody has tried to treat a transgender person according to that, the results have been disastrous. It's wrong. It's not accurate. And that's the difference. That's why much like homosexuality, being transgender is not a mental illness. If anything, it's a biochemical imbalance, right? It's a physiological issue. It's an issue with the endocrine system or something. But it is not a mental illness, because if it's a mental illness, you basically retrain the thinking, or you medicate the thinking to bring the mind in line with the body. You don't change the body to fit the mind. And that's why the whole trans issue is so fraught in the fields of psychiatry and psychology. Is it's the way it's classified as a mental illness right now for funding reasons breaks the rule book. And you can understand why people would question that all of a sudden, no, we're changing the rules. Well, that doesn't make any sense. The reality is there is something biological in the non-reductive version of biology going on here. And that means trans people are not aberrations. They are not birth defects. They are not, mentally ill people. They were just born this way, and they deserve dignity, and they deserve to live their lives with the least amount of dysphoria and the least amount of dissonance regarding identity as they can get, as does everybody. I am really sick of people, nerd shaming, or God, there's a trial going on in Toronto right now where a mass killer is trying to beat a murder charge by claiming autism tells him he means he doesn't know the difference between right and wrong. Everybody thinks that I've talked to thinks the defense is crazy, but someone's trying it, right? That's bonkers. So that's where I'm going to leave that. There was one comment, and I'm just going to read it because I don't quite understand what it meant, because nothing I said falls into this line, but I'm going to read it just for the sake of reading it. Agree with most of what you said about gender identity and expression, but I don't think we should be too quick to dismiss the concerns of people like, they say transsexual, so I'm going to say transgender, for whom gender expression is their identity and don't like being lumped in with non-binaries, and others for whom gender expression is meaningless. They're not the same thing and don't like being referred to as though they are. I never said that. What I said was some people have a weak gender identity or no gender identity. They don't know what it is yet. That's what the non-binary category is for. If someone's, a trans woman and they're like, I'm a woman, yeah. And if they want to be able to express their womanhood in traditional ways, yeah. It's more, I do know some people who they're trans women, but they don't want to wear a dress every day, right? Like, that's not their thing. They wear jeans and a t-shirt, but they're female. Same thing with trans men. I know a couple of trans men who don't take hormones. They just, do their hair a certain way, use the he pronoun. They're not dysphoric enough to need to take that step. And that is fine. They still deserve recognition as their, they deserve to have their gender identity affirmed. And that's why, again, the term transgender replaced the term transsexual. There is no right way to be a trans person. There is no checklist of behaviors that a person must perform to be considered legitimately trans other than identifying with and living as their gender identity. That's it. End of story. Now, an interesting question came up, and I know this guy was kind of sheepish about asking it, and this is a little off topic, but it was an interesting question, and it did come from a person who's a furry. And so, he pointed out that to furries, their fursona is who they are on the inside, and can be, as he said, can be as real to them as gender. And the issue here, and I am not, some people may find this offensive. It's not intended as offensive. Squirrel is not a legal category, right? Like, that's totally fine through shamanistic traditions and various, human ceremony throughout history. People have identified with characteristics associated with animals, but no one has their animal species on a government issued ID. We have to be really careful with that, because with furry personas, there are sort of two buckets, broad buckets of people. This is a generalization, yes, but there are people who use their fursona as a series of metaphors to sort of define their experience. And that's totally cool, right? There is some mental illness in other people as well, right? Like, this is actually a point that's offensive to some trans people. A family member of mine got really offended once when some way she thought I was comparing my cat to her kid. And it's like, well, if the shoe fits. No, I'm just kidding. People get really, really edgy about my child is not an animal. Now, that is people who think that humans have some higher status than animals do. And the truth is, under the law, humans do have an elevated status. If you eat a human, you're in trouble, right? If you eat a chicken, you're not. So we have to be kind of careful with that, because even within furries, some people have a fursona that is the same gender as they are. Other people have a fursona that is not their legal gender at the time. Those are different experiences. And that's the important thing about trans rights, is you're actually talking about something that impacts a government issued ID. This isn't just a series of performances. This isn't just about internal identity. It's how the government identifies you. And a huge issue with trans people in for instance, prison, is they're put in the wrong section of the prison. So trans women are housed with men and trans men are housed with women. And that can cause a lot of problems. So while, yes, I understand that people's fursonas are very, very real to them, it is not, I mean, again, you can't compare gender identity to race. You can't compare gender identity to furries. Like, these categories are just not comparable. Again, if someone believes that it's sort of a totemistic ritual, cool. If somebody actually thinks they're a fox, think about that for a minute, right? Would you go into your doctor and say, I'm a fox, treat me as one? No, you wouldn't, right? No, that's not reasonable accommodation. Whereas someone comes in and says, you know, I'm a woman, so I'd be more comfortable with a female doctor. Different, right? Like, there are just certain categories that are more applicable in our society or more relevant in our society than others, right? Fursona is more like hair color than gender identity, right? You don't list your hair color on your driver's license because people change the color of their hair, but it's one of the importance, and the more I talk about this, I get it, the more it branches out. Like, there's prisons, there's also, like, if somebody is affirming their gender in their gender expression, but they're listed as a different gender identity on their ID, that can get them into trouble with, you know, crossing the border or something like that, because a government official will go, this isn't you. This is a man, you're a woman, right? Or this is a woman, you're a man. Or, you know, some governments have put O or X gender identity, meaning non-binary, on their documentation. Others haven't done them yet, but do let people, when they go from male to female or female to male, they do let people change that on their official government ID. That's what makes that different, right? So these are the sorts of things that are important to keep in mind when we discuss these things. Now, maybe a bunch of furries will be angry at me right now or offended right now, but we deal in facts here, and it's just a fact that what animal you identify with is not on your government ID. So, you know, this is one of these things that just because somebody else is getting attention right now, and one particular realm of activism is having a moment. Trans people are having a moment right now, okay? Black people in the US are having a moment right now in terms of awareness of their issues. That doesn't mean that your experience and your issue is not valid. It just means that collectively, culture can only move forward with a couple things at any given time. And no one should require that mass external validation to feel like their identity is valid. I'll just leave that there. Maybe that's something to talk about later. We don't have time for this right now because people will say, well, that could be true of gender. this is a process, okay? And this is why I didn't share this video on Twitter. We can keep talking about this. I think it's important to keep talking about this. And if you don't quite get this yet, that's okay. The only thing that can be expected of you is that you try. Okay? Okay. And I'll leave the weekend with that. Help support this channel. Become a monthly patron. Patreon.com/LeannaK. Thanks for watching.